Well, 9 years on since that fateful day, and we continue to reflect on those events right now. Now, most of the recommendations of the Marikana report, compiled by public policing experts and submitted to the Minister of Police, Bheki Cele, are yet to be implemented. Now, Cele said that some of those recommendations will only be realized when the SAPS Act Amendment Bill is passed and effected. The report, which was finally published in March this year, was submitted to Minister Cele in 2018. He then said the process to criminally prosecute police members involved in the Marikana Massacre is ongoing. And today we speak to Eldred de Klerk, a senior associate of the African Centre for Security and Intelligence Praxis, ACSIP, and he is also a member of the policing experts who produced the Marikana report. Eldred, thanks so much for your time and welcome to Morning Live.
Thank you, Zakina, and good morning to the viewers.
So, it's 9 years on, and just to get a sense from someone who was involved in compiling the report and looking at the actions of police on that fateful day and in the lead-up as well. But as far as the panel goes in compiling that report, what were some of the hopes that you had in terms of that this report would actually lead to?
Well, thank you, Sakina. I think it's an opportunity for us to reflect. Unfortunately, 9 years on, we do this every year since, and I hope that we won't do it for the next 9 years. In accepting the full report and recommendations of the Commission, the Marikana Commission, Parliament, on our behalf, made a promise that effectively they said, we take responsibility for what happened, and we promise that will never happen again. Events since then, and especially in the last while, has reflected that the South African police remains a manifestation of its colonial and apartheid past. Let's accept on face value that the recommendations and a lot of what we've recommended will happen through the public process of rewriting the Police Act and other legislation. That is small comfort, because principally what we've said as the panel of experts is that we're looking in line with the NDP for a professional, competent, principled police service that enjoys the highest level of integrity and credibility. No act will ensure that. That is a question of public leadership. And what we've seen with the South African police service is consistent failures of public leadership. And we've seen a lack of political will to, in fact, transform the South African police service.
So let's just unpack that a little further, because I think this is important, because every time when the question is posed about how far are we with regard to the implementation of these recommendations, as you heard, some of the explanation would be that there's a need for some amendment to the current policing bill. So when you say that is not necessary, let's talk to the actual thrust of your findings, and also to what extent some of the more than 100 recommendations have been implemented, both in terms of your recommendations as they were stated on paper, Eldred, and also observing some of the recent public uprisings, which has, of course, prompted some of us to ask the question again of the implementation of those recommendations.
Indeed. Look, policing is a principled activity. It's an activity undertaken by competent professionals, and it's an activity undertaken to serve the common good and to fulfill our common purpose of feeling safe and secure. That's the first thing. And we need to accept that, and we need to accept responsibility for that. Police is also a public service institution that is accountable, firstly, to the cabinet, the responsible cabinet minister, and then to the whole of Parliament, and therefore to us. Sakina, no legislation says to me that I have to do that. The current legislation and its prescripts actually suffices insofar as saying that you're accountable to Parliament and that you're accountable to the people of South Africa. Let's just accept that. This idea that the police is a lone-standing institution that is separate from the people of South Africa, that actually defines the people of South Africa and their actions and their popular dissent as criminal, that's a decision. And what happened in Marikana was that police interjected themselves into what ostensibly was a labor dispute. They had no business being there. They made an operational decision to actually get involved in the process at Marikana. Therefore, they can make the same decision that they will lead, which is what the principle of our recommendations was, a public-spirited process to engage on the state of policing, to engage our recommendations and the full body of work of the panel of experts and the NDP and the constitutional mandate, and that will be a publicly led process by a competent team of people who will facilitate the process of public discourse and dialogue. That's a political decision. You don't need legislation to enact and to facilitate that process happening. And this is where I think the engagement as to what happens to the police, how far we've come, should not have been a question that we should be asking, because we should have been involved in the whole process of determining the South African Police Service into the 21st century. And the fact that there's a lack of this public-spirited process is actually the biggest failure.
So if we look at recent events, Eldred, especially the recent unrest and looting that we saw, that called into question once again the competence of the South African Police Service in dealing with public disorder. So how far would you say, or have you been able to assess, has the South African Police Service gone in actually implementing the recommendations that you came up with as a panel?
Well, for an example, if we look at all the conventions the South African Police Service signs up, South Africa is part of SADC, we undertake peacekeeping operations, we subject ourselves to the UN treaties and other treaties that we are part of. There are a number of principles involved in those treaties. One of the principles, for example, is non-engagement or non-intervention. I apologize. The South African Police Service seems to think that their role, whenever people take to the streets or when anything happens in a crowded situation or there's mass protest, that immediately they should get involved. What happened in the fateful days in July? The South African Police Service said they were trying to prevent another Marikana. Well, effectively, that's actually a bad reflection of their understanding of what we were trying to say. When we said, don't intervene if it's going to cause a direct threat to life by your actions, is not going to further escalate the situation. That doesn't mean that you don't look to prevent the situation from escalating. That doesn't mean that you don't set up communications. That doesn't mean that you look to not confine and cordon off areas that are vulnerable, and that you look to engage the protesters or the looters in this case and make sure that they understand that there's consequence to their actions. Doing nothing is not what a professional police service does. And then, so partly what we're saying, Sakina, is that police don't seem to have internalized their own prescripts, and therefore it's not reflective in their routine practices or their daily police actions. Unfortunately, when you betray your prescripts, because legislation is not the hallmark of what policing is, it's the regulations, the national instructions, and the prescripts that govern, that flow from legislation. Police seems unable or unwilling to actually follow their own rules. And this is, again, it comes back to the question of public leadership.
And one has to look at the question of leadership because, again, without necessarily belaboring the point, but the recent unrest once again pointed to a leadership issue, because I thought it very curious, Eldred, that wholesale the police seem to not act at all. So one can only but assume, and of course stand to be corrected if there's anyone out there listening, minister, commissioner, whoever, but it just seemed curious that across the board, uniformly, the police acted in exactly the same manner in KwaZulu-Natal and in Gauteng as this unrest was unfolding. So in terms of that, when you say police are seemingly, not internalizing what they should know, what they should do, how do individual police officers on the ground actually follow their mandated duty when perhaps there is orders from the top that they shouldn't?
Well, indeed, you hit the nail on the head. Police is a hierarchical organization, and Marikana showed that, because generals and brigadiers can come in and override competent public order police service members. Once again, when members act, they act under instruction. What they do, even when they use force, or when they choose not to use force and they use other means to bring the situation under control, including negotiations, communications, setting up and a rapport with those they find on the streets, that's a question of public leadership. One of the critical elements of the work of the panel of experts was to say that we need stronger training for all our command officers from the national, provincial, all the way down to the local level. This didn't happen. So it's a decision, and no member act on his own behalf. So it seems on the face of it that a decision was made to actually engage in the way they did. And that shows, to my mind, the actual police have undermined and underestimated what they were dealing with, and it's reflection of the actual incompetence of the South African Police Service to actually be ready for policing in the 21st century.
So, going back to Marikana, Eldred, if we look at what happened recently, the Gauteng High Court in Johannesburg dismissed with costs former National Police Commissioner Ria Piega's application to have the findings of the Marikana Commission into the death of the 44 Lonmin mine workers and police officers who died. That decision was, of course, dismissed. But in your view, did the police act irresponsibly? Just bottom line it for me.
Well, the police had no business in what was a labor dispute. They made a fateful and critical error in deciding that that action will come to an end on that day. That decision actually led to the loss of lives that we saw. And so essentially, that was a political decision by a public service institution. From whoever's direction, that remains unclear. And that fateful decision is what led to the actions on the 16th of August.
So it's also understood that the panel recommended that supporting documents should be made public. And if we look at those actions, of course, and these documents that were to be made public, they were not. So looking at that, what important aspects can you share with us of such documentation that would have been important for the public to know? What do those documents actually reveal?
Well, those documents revealed what they tried to say to us. We needed a fuller picture of what happened in Marikana, and we needed a fuller picture of the culture and the routine practice, the decision-making, and the command of the South African Police Service that led to that fateful day. This is a public process, and it's in the public interest to reveal it. The late Judge David Nishangazi, may his soul rest in peace, was the chairperson of the panel of experts. He led us with great dedication and a big amount of humility. He simply asked of the South African Police Service and the Minister to ensure that they investigate fuller, seen to, and they make the money available to IPID. That didn't happen. He also made a plea before his passing that there be a full public accountability in terms of the culpability of any members of the South African Police Service. That didn't happen. The third thing he says, part of our recommendations was that there be structured training for the command staff of the South African Police Service. This hasn't happened. So essentially then what we're saying is that our findings and our view around demilitarization, our view around professionalization, our view around the principles that should govern public policing, including public order policing, and our understanding of the value basis and doctrine that should inform a police service should be subject to peer review, subject to public dialogue and public participation, so that every South African owns it, every South African has spoken to it, and every South African feels confident going forward in what they can expect routinely and predictably from the South African Police Service. A failure to lead on this is the biggest betrayal of public trust that we've seen today.
And Eldred, we're out of time, but I just have to put this to you. The Police Minister, Bheki Cele, has spoken out, severally about the silence of civil society and others regarding the killing of police, not only during Marikana, but generally. Now, in the Marikana case regarding police killings, how can we look at what happened there and give equal importance to both situations without making one more important than the other, as it were?
I simply acknowledge that it happened. I don't think anybody of us are comfortable with the killing of anybody, be it somebody in uniform or an ordinary civilian like you and I. There are inherent risks, yes, in being a member of any police service, and the ordinary law-abiding South African accepts that any killing of anybody is not we don't accept that. We condone it in the strongest terms. My problem with the idea that police somehow are different from you and I sets up and continues this divide between us and the South African police members. I don't think members want that. I don't think you're speaking on behalf of members when you say that there seems to be no outcry from the part of civil society, because you simply can say to civil society, maybe a better way of civil society is saying, we acknowledge what has happened, and please, our members and our public safety of our members are equally important, and leave it at that.
Well, Eldred, thanks so much for your time. Eldred de Klerk is a policing expert and senior associate of the African Centre for Security and Intelligence Praxis, ACSIP, and he's also a member of the panel that produced a report on the Marikana Massacre, and he was sharing some aspects of the findings of that report with us. This is where I have to say goodbye to our